The best gift is when you're gone, Lucas Carter said, his voice flat and careless, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than speaking to his grandmother. Evelyn Carter did not flinch, did not gasp, did not correct him. At 72, she had learned that silence often carried more weight than any argument. The dining room was warm, set carefully with placemats she had ironed that morning, the kind with faint blue stitching she remembered buying nearly 20 years earlier. A roast sat in the center of the table, resting after hours in the oven, its aroma filling the room with the comforting smell of rosemary and pepper. This was supposed to be a simple family dinner, nothing ceremonial, nothing heavy, just another evening Evelyn had quietly funded and carefully prepared, as she always did. Lucas leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting over his knee, his phone glowing in his hand, as if the moment were already over for him. Across the table, Mark Carter, Evelyn's son, looked down at his plate, studying the grain of the wood as though it might offer an escape. Rachel, Mark's wife, pressed her lips together in something that resembled a smile, but never quite reached her eyes. No one laughed. No one scolded Lucas. No one said that words like that were cruel, or unnecessary, or wrong. Evelyn noticed all of it. She noticed the way Rachel reached for her water glass, taking a slow sip to avoid speaking. She noticed how Mark shifted in his seat, adjusting his napkin, clearing his throat without sound. She noticed the way Lucas's younger sister watched her brother with mild interest, waiting to see if there would be consequences. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, her fingers resting lightly against each other, steady despite the quiet pressure building in her chest. For a moment, she looked at Lucas, really looked at him, at the boy she once rocked to sleep when he was afraid of thunderstorms, at the teenager whose first car she helped pay for, at the young man who now spoke to her, as if she were an inconvenience nearing its expiration date. The words echoed again in her mind, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a dull certainty that settled deep and stayed there. The best gift is when you're gone. Evelyn stood slowly, pushing her chair back, with care so it wouldn't scrape the floor. The sound was soft, controlled, nothing that could be accused of drama. She smoothed the front of her cardigan, a pale gray one she kept for evenings like this, and nodded once, more to herself than to anyone else. "I'm tired," she said simply, her voice calm and even. "You can finish dinner." No one protested. No one followed her. She walked down the hallway at an unhurried pace, past framed photographs that told a different version of the family story, one where smiles were wide and arms were linked, where holidays meant togetherness and not obligation. In her bedroom, Evelyn closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled sounds of silverware and low conversation continuing without her. She did not cry. Crying would have implied surprise, and there was none left. Instead, her mind moved backward and forward at once, measuring years, calculating moments, assembling patterns she had ignored for far too long. She thought of the tuition checks she had written without hesitation, the down payment she had quietly provided when Mark and Rachel bought their house, the monthly transfers she made to help until things settled, though they never seemed to. She thought of birthdays she hosted, vacations she paid for but did not attend, decisions made around her rather than with her. Lucas's sentence had not come from nowhere. It had simply said aloud what the rest of them had learned to communicate through glances, through assumptions, through silence. Down the hall, laughter rose briefly, then faded. Evelyn lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above her, counting each rotation without meaning to. Somewhere between one turn and the next, something shifted, not violently, not emotionally, but with quiet precision. By the time the house went still and the guests prepared to leave, Evelyn had already reached a conclusion, one that did not require confrontation or explanation. Words had been offered freely that evening. They had cost her family far more than they realized, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised even her, that the sentence spoken at the dinner table was not an ending. It was a beginning. Evelyn Carter woke before sunrise the next morning, not because she was restless, but because her body had followed the same rhythm for decades, the kind that did not disappear just because the house felt different now. The hallway outside her bedroom was quiet, the air cool, carrying the faint smell of last night's dinner that had never quite been finished. She dressed slowly, choosing simple clothes, a pressed blouse and slacks, Nothing special, nothing careless. In the kitchen, she poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window as it brewed, watching the pale light stretch across the lawn she had paid to keep trimmed long after her knees made yard work uncomfortable. The house belonged to her on paper and in memory, but lately it had felt like borrowed space, a place she was allowed to occupy as long as she remained useful and silent. She carried her coffee to the small breakfast table and sat down, noticing how the chair across from her remained empty, just as it always did in the mornings. Mark and Rachel rarely woke early unless there was somewhere else to be, and Lucas slept through most mornings without concern for anything that did not involve him directly. The quiet gave Evelyn room to think, though she did not frame her thoughts as anger or sadness. She thought in numbers and timelines, in obligations fulfilled and assumptions made. She remembered the year Mark asked her to co-sign a loan, promising it was temporary, how she had agreed without hesitation. She remembered the months Rachel stayed home while she found her footing, and the grocery bills Evelyn covered without ever mentioning them again. She remembered Lucas at 16, sulking about a used car he thought beneath him, and how she had written a check large enough to turn his disappointment into gratitude, at least for a while. Gratitude, she realized, had a shelf life. As the coffee cooled, Evelyn reached for a legal pad she kept in a kitchen drawer, the kind with yellow pages and a firm backing. She did not write emotional notes or accusations. She wrote names. She wrote dates. She wrote amounts she remembered clearly enough to estimate without exaggeration. Tuition, rent assistance, medical bills, travel expenses, small monthly transfers that added up quietly over time. There was no bitterness in the list, only accuracy. When she finished, she folded the paper neatly and returned it to the drawer, not because she needed it as proof, but because it helped her see the pattern laid out plainly, without the fog of family loyalty blurring the edges. Later that morning, Evelyn took her purse and keys and left the house without announcing it. The drive across town took less than 15 minutes, a route she had taken many times before, past familiar storefronts and intersections that reminded her how long she had lived there. She parked, walked inside, and greeted the receptionist by name, exchanging the kind of polite smile reserved for people who knew you well enough not to ask unnecessary questions. In the waiting area, she sat upright, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. When her name was called, she followed the attorney into an office lined with shelves and certificates, closing the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click. They spoke plainly. Evelyn asked specific questions and listened carefully to the answers. She did not dramatize the previous evening or repeat the words spoken at the dinner table. She did not need to. The conversation stayed focused on documents, on authority, on finality. When she left, the sun was higher, the parking lot busier, the world moving as usual, unaware that a long-standing balance had quietly shifted. That afternoon, Evelyn returned home to find the house louder, voices rising and falling as Mark and Rachel moved through rooms without acknowledging her return. Lucas passed through the kitchen at one point, grabbing a drink from the refrigerator, nodding vaguely in her direction without meeting her eyes. No one asked where she had been. No one asked how she felt. Evelyn sat in her chair by the window, hands folded, observing without participating. For the first time in years, she felt no urgency to smooth things over, no instinct to explain herself or restore comfort. The words from the night before no longer echoed sharply. They had settled into something colder and more useful, a reference point rather than a wound. As evening approached, Evelyn rose and went to her room, closing the door behind her once more. The house continued around her, busy and careless, but she remained apart from it now, not as a guest waiting for permission, but as someone who had already made a decision and saw no reason to announce it prematurely. What had been said could not be taken back, and what would come next did not require another word. Evelyn Carter spent the following day moving through the house as if she were already a visitor rather than its anchor, noting details she had once managed without thought. The mail arrived late that morning, a thin stack of envelopes addressed mostly to Mark and Rachel, utilities and credit card statements that Evelyn recognized from years of quietly making sure they never went unpaid. She placed the mail on the entry table and continued on, her steps unhurried, her expression neutral. In the living room, Lucas sat on the couch scrolling through his phone, his feet propped on the coffee table Evelyn had refinished herself more than a decade earlier. He barely looked up when she passed, offering a distracted greeting that carried no warmth and no respect. Evelyn nodded once and kept walking, resisting the old habit of reminding him about his feet, about manners, about gratitude. That habit no longer served her. In the afternoon, Rachel approached her in the kitchen with a tone that suggested casual concern rather than sincerity, mentioning grocery costs and hinting that prices seemed higher lately, as if testing whether Evelyn would volunteer to cover the difference, as she always had. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her face calm, her hands steady as she dried a plate and placed it carefully in the cabinet. When Rachel finished speaking, Evelyn simply said she had already eaten and would not be needing dinner that evening. The response seemed to confuse Rachel, who lingered for a moment before leaving the room without another word. Later, Mark attempted a different approach, knocking lightly on Evelyn's bedroom door and asking if everything was all right, his voice carrying a rehearsed gentleness. Evelyn answered him with polite brevity, assuring him she was fine and needed rest. He accepted the answer too easily, relieved not to be drawn into a conversation that might require accountability. Alone again, Evelyn sat at her desk and opened a small wooden box that held important papers she rarely needed to access. Inside were documents that marked transitions in her life, the death certificate of her husband, old insurance policies, and the most recent version of her will, signed and dated years earlier, when she believed clarity and kindness were enough to protect her intentions. She read through it slowly, line by line, not with regret, but with focus, identifying provisions that no longer reflected reality. The language assumed gratitude where there was entitlement, connection where there was convenience. She closed the folder and returned it to the box, already aware that this version would not remain valid for long. That evening, voices drifted up from the dining room as the family ate without her, laughter rising briefly at something Lucas said, then dissolving into background noise. Evelyn remained in her room, reading a novel she had started weeks ago but barely remembered, her mind elsewhere. She thought of how easily people adjusted to comfort they did not earn, how quickly generosity became expectation. The sentence Lucas had spoken had not been challenged by anyone else at the table, and that silence had spoken just as clearly. It told Evelyn where she stood, not as a grandmother to be respected, but as a resource whose continued presence was tolerated rather than valued. As night settled, Evelyn turned off her lamp and lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, pipes ticking, floorboards creaking. There was no sadness in her chest, only resolve, solid and quiet. By the time morning came again, she knew that nothing would be said out loud until everything was already decided. The family believed time was on their side, that routines would resume and discomfort would fade as it always had. They did not understand that for Evelyn, the moment of doubt had passed, replaced by a clarity that did not require permission or discussion. She rose with the sun once more, composed and purposeful, carrying within her a decision that would soon redefine the future they all assumed was secure. Evelyn Carter spent the next several days observing rather than intervening, allowing routines to unfold without her quiet corrections. Morning coffee brewed later than it used to because she no longer rose to prepare it for everyone. Laundry baskets filled and remained untouched. Groceries dwindled faster than usual, and she noticed Rachel checking the pantry with a faint crease of irritation between her brows. Evelyn did not comment. She had learned that absence revealed more than confrontation ever could. One afternoon, Lucas complained aloud about the internet speed while sprawled across the couch, tapping his phone impatiently and muttering that the service should be upgraded. Mark responded with vague agreement, already calculating costs out loud, and then both glanced toward Evelyn out of habit, waiting for her to offer a solution. She did not look up from her book. The moment stretched, awkward and unfamiliar, until Mark cleared his throat and said they would look into it later. The sound of disappointment that followed was subtle but unmistakable. That evening, Rachel mentioned a medical bill in passing, her tone carefully neutral, as if testing whether the old reflex would kick in. Evelyn listened and nodded, neither agreeing nor declining, and returned to her reading without reaching for her purse. The conversation moved on quickly, but the shift lingered in the room like a draft through an open window. At night, Evelyn sorted through memories the way she once sorted through household paperwork, calmly, without sentimentality. She recalled the first year after her husband passed, how Mark and Rachel insisted she move in with them for her own good, how grateful she had been at the time, mistaking proximity for care. She remembered paying the property taxes quietly when Mark fell behind, refinancing the house in her name when the bank threatened consequences, and then transferring it back once the pressure eased. She remembered telling herself that families helped each other, that love did not keep receipts. The problem, she realized, was that she had been the only one giving without expecting balance. By midweek, Evelyn made another visit downtown, walking the same route with the same steady pace, carrying a folder tucked neatly under her arm. This time, the conversation was shorter, more precise. Decisions were confirmed. Documents were prepared. Evelyn signed where she was instructed, her hand steady, her expression unreadable. There was no rush and no hesitation, only completion. When she left, she stopped for lunch at a small cafe she had not visited in years, ordering soup and bread, sitting alone by the window. The simplicity of the meal pleased her. It reminded her that independence did not require spectacle, only intention. Back at the house, tension grew quietly as days passed without Evelyn resuming her former role. Mark grew restless, checking accounts more frequently, noticing patterns that no longer aligned with his expectations. Rachel began suggesting cost-cutting measures that felt less like planning and more like anxiety. Lucas complained openly about inconveniences, his irritation sharpening now that solutions did not materialize automatically. None of them addressed Evelyn directly. They circled her presence carefully, as if unsure which version of her they were dealing with. On Friday evening, Mark finally attempted to bridge the gap, inviting Evelyn to sit with them after dinner. She joined them briefly, listening as he spoke about family unity and misunderstandings, his words practiced but hollow. Evelyn met his gaze and thanked him for his concern, assuring him she was content and needed nothing. The conversation stalled there, unable to progress without her willingness to engage emotionally. Later that night, Evelyn returned to her room and closed the door, feeling neither isolated nor rejected. She felt complete. The household had begun to sense that something fundamental had changed, though they could not yet name it. They assumed discomfort would pass, that Evelyn would soften, that familiarity would restore order. What they did not understand was that Evelyn had already stepped beyond negotiation. The structure they depended on was no longer intact, and while they still lived beneath the same roof, the foundation had quietly shifted. By the time they realized how much they had relied on what they never acknowledged, it would already be too late to undo. Evelyn Carter noticed the shift before anyone named it out loud, the subtle tightening of behavior that followed uncertainty when expectations were no longer met. By the weekend, the house carried a different energy, not openly hostile, but edged with calculation. Rachel began making lists, tapping numbers into her phone while standing at the kitchen counter, her brow furrowed as she muttered about rising costs and unexpected expenses. Mark spent more time on his laptop, sighing loudly as he reviewed statements, occasionally glancing toward Evelyn's closed door as if answers might appear there unprompted. Lucas, less patient than the rest, expressed his frustration openly, complaining about canceled plans and limitations that had never existed before. He spoke as if comfort were a right rather than a privilege, his irritation growing sharper with each small inconvenience. Evelyn observed it all from a distance, sitting in her chair by the window or moving quietly through the house, no longer anticipating needs or smoothing edges. She realized that without her steady presence filling gaps, the family did not know how to recalibrate. They were unused to adjusting downward, to questioning whether something was necessary or merely assumed. One afternoon, Rachel asked directly if Evelyn planned to continue helping with certain household expenses, framing it as a temporary question, her tone careful but strained. Evelyn met her eyes and replied evenly that everyone needed to be mindful of their own responsibilities. There was no accusation in her voice, only finality. Rachel nodded, though her disappointment was clear, and left the room without pressing further. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Later that day, Mark attempted to re-establish familiarity, suggesting they all go out to dinner, his voice overly bright, as if a pleasant evening could restore balance. Evelyn declined politely, saying she already had plans. This was not entirely untrue. Her plans simply did not include them. She spent that evening reviewing paperwork at her desk, rereading documents she had signed earlier in the week, ensuring every detail reflected her intentions clearly. There was comfort in precision, in knowing that no ambiguity remained. As days passed, Lucas grew bolder in his complaints, voicing irritation that Evelyn seemed distant, that she no longer attended to things the way she used to. He spoke within her hearing, though not directly to her, as if provoking a response. Evelyn did not react. She understood now that confrontation would only grant him the attention he sought. Instead, she allowed his words to pass through the house unanswered, diminishing their power through indifference. On Sunday morning, Evelyn dressed carefully and left early, returning later than usual. The family did not ask where she had been, though curiosity was evident. That evening, while they gathered in the living room, she remained in her room, reading quietly, the door closed. The separation was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The house functioned without her input, awkwardly and inefficiently, but she resisted the urge to intervene. She had spent years proving her usefulness. Now she was proving something else entirely. That night, Evelyn reflected on the sentence Lucas had spoken days earlier, not with pain, but with clarity. It had revealed a truth she could no longer ignore. The family had not valued her presence, only her contributions. With those contributions withdrawn, their discomfort surfaced quickly, exposing how dependent they had become on something they dismissed. Evelyn felt no satisfaction in their unease, only confirmation. The process she had set in motion was already working, not through punishment, but through exposure. By removing herself quietly, she had allowed them to see the structure they relied upon, now absent. As she prepared for bed, Evelyn felt steady, certain that whatever reactions came next would not alter her course. The groundwork had been laid carefully, and while the family sensed change, they still underestimated its scope. They believed the situation temporary, a phase to be managed until normalcy returned. Evelyn knew better. The version of normal they expected no longer existed, and soon they would learn that some absences could not be reversed once accepted. Evelyn Carter sensed the tension crystallize into something sharper as the week progressed. No longer vague discomfort, but a quiet reckoning the family tried to manage without naming. Bills arrived and were opened with more care than before. Conversations hushed when she entered a room, then resumed once she passed. Mark began asking questions that sounded casual but carried urgency, mentioning timing and budgets, wondering aloud how long certain arrangements were meant to last. Evelyn responded with polite brevity, offering neither reassurance nor resistance, her tone calm enough to discourage follow-up. Rachel grew more vigilant, tracking expenses with a diligence that bordered on anxiety, her earlier confidence replaced by calculation. Lucas, frustrated by limits he had never encountered, spoke more loudly, scoffing at delays and restrictions, his irritation rising as his assumptions failed to materialize. Evelyn listened without engagement, understanding that acknowledgement would only invite negotiation. One morning, Mark approached her in the kitchen with a careful smile and suggested a conversation about expectations, framing it as a chance to clear misunderstandings. Evelyn agreed to listen and took a seat at the table, folding her hands, waiting. Mark spoke at length about family support, about how things had always worked, about the stress of change, his words circling the subject without landing. When he paused, Evelyn thanked him for sharing and said she trusted everyone would adapt. She did not promise anything. The conversation ended with uncertainty hanging between them, heavier for having been named. That afternoon, Evelyn took a short walk around the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces with a composed smile, noticing how ordinary the world appeared despite the shift underway. When she returned, she found Lucas in the driveway arguing with a friend on the phone about money, his voice sharp, his frustration unfiltered. He noticed her and turned away, lowering his voice, embarrassment flickering across his expression. Had upset her recently. The question sounded rehearsed, an attempt to diagnose without accountability. Evelyn met her gaze and replied that appreciation was shown through actions, not questions. Rachel nodded, absorbing the statement without reply. As night fell, the household settled into uneasy quiet, each person retreating to private worries. Evelyn sat at her desk and reviewed the calendar, noting appointments she had already completed and those still to come. She felt no anticipation, only readiness. The process she had set in motion required patience, not force. By midweek, the family's concern turned to speculation. They spoke in lowered voices about what Evelyn might be planning, whether she was unhappy, whether she intended to leave. No one asked her directly. Evelyn observed their caution with detached clarity, recognizing fear where entitlement once stood. She remembered how often she had protected them from consequences, how she had intervened before problems grew visible. Now she allowed the discomfort to exist, believing it necessary. One evening, Lucas confronted her indirectly, muttering that everything felt tense lately and that people should not hold grudges over comments. Evelyn looked at him then, her expression neutral, and said calmly that words revealed values, not moods. The statement unsettled him, and he left the room without reply. That night, Evelyn slept soundly, untroubled by doubt. She knew the family was approaching the edge of understanding, sensing that the balance they relied on had shifted beyond repair. The absence they felt was not temporary withdrawal, but a permanent recalibration. They would soon learn that what they had dismissed as background support was, in fact, the structure itself. Evelyn remained composed, aware that the next step would not require confrontation, only completion, and that when the realization arrived, it would be undeniable and irreversible. Evelyn Carter chose the following morning deliberately, not because it carried symbolism, but because it allowed no room for delay. The house was quieter than usual as she dressed, the family having already left for their respective obligations, each carrying an unspoken worry they could not yet define. Evelyn moved through her room with practiced calm, selecting documents from the wooden box and placing them neatly into her bag, checking once more that everything was in order. There was no trembling in her hands, no hesitation in her movements. This was not an emotional decision made in the heat of injury, but a conclusion reached. After careful observation and restraint, she left the house without leaving a note, locking the door behind her as she had done thousands of times before, the sound firm and final. At the attorney's office, the process unfolded exactly as planned. Evelyn reviewed each page slowly, ensuring the language reflected her intent without ambiguity. Names were removed with the same precision they had once been added, provisions adjusted to eliminate assumptions that no longer held true. She asked questions, received clear answers, and signed where indicated, her signature steady and unmistakable. There was no dramatic exchange, no speech about betrayal or regret. The room held only the quiet efficiency of a task being completed. When it was done, Evelyn gathered her belongings and stood, thanking the attorney politely before leaving. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as she walked to her car, feeling neither triumph nor sorrow, only resolution. She stopped briefly at a grocery store on the way home, purchasing only what she needed, moving through the aisles without distraction. The simplicity of the errand grounded her, reinforcing that life continued even as foundations shifted. When she returned to the house, Mark's car was already in the driveway. Inside, voices carried from the living room, tense and clipped. Evelyn entered quietly, placing her bag on the entry table before joining them. Mark stood abruptly when he saw her, his expression tight, while Rachel sat rigidly on the couch, her hands clasped together. Lucas hovered near the doorway, his posture defensive, as if he already sensed what had changed but could not yet articulate it. Mark spoke first, asking where Evelyn had been, his tone strained despite attempts at politeness. Evelyn replied evenly that she had taken care of some personal matters. There was a pause, heavy and expectant. Rachel asked then, carefully, whether everything was all right, her voice betraying unease. Evelyn looked at them, not with anger, but with clarity, and said that everything was settled. The word hung in the air, misunderstood but unmistakable. Lucas scoffed quietly, muttering that things had been strange lately, that people were overreacting. Evelyn turned her gaze toward him briefly, then away, offering no response. There was nothing left to explain. She excused herself and went to her room, closing the door behind her with the same quiet certainty she had practiced all week. In the hours that followed, tension escalated without her involvement. Phone calls were made, whispers exchanged, assumptions tested and discarded. By evening, Mark knocked on Evelyn's door again, asking directly if she had changed anything that might affect the family. Evelyn opened the door and met his eyes, her expression calm, and said simply that she had made arrangements that reflected her values. She did not elaborate. Mark stood there, absorbing the implication, his face pale, as understanding began to take shape. Evelyn wished him a good night and closed the door once more. Alone, she sat at her desk, the day complete. The decision had been executed without confrontation, without spectacle, exactly as she intended. Whatever reaction followed would belong to them, not her. She had reclaimed authority over her life, not through punishment, but through alignment between words and consequences. The shift was complete, and even though the family had not yet grasped its full scope, Evelyn knew they soon would. There would be no reversal, no negotiation, only the quiet certainty of an outcome already set in motion. The consequences began to surface the next morning, not with shouting or demands, but with frantic energy that filled the house unevenly. Mark paced the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, repeating questions to someone on the other end, his voice tight with disbelief. Rachel sat at the table scrolling through emails, her composure cracking as she reread messages that confirmed what she had feared. Lucas moved restlessly from room to room, opening doors, checking drawers, as if answers might be hidden somewhere physical. No one spoke to Evelyn directly at first. They circled her presence cautiously, aware now that something irreversible had occurred. By midday, Mark confronted the reality he had tried to deny, slamming his hand lightly against the counter in frustration, demanding explanations from Rachel, from Lucas, from anyone but himself. Rachel responded with strained logic, insisting there must have been a misunderstanding, that Evelyn would never follow through on something so drastic. Lucas scoffed, dismissing the situation as exaggerated, until he attempted to access an account he had always assumed would be there and found it unavailable. His confidence faltered then, irritation giving way to panic. Evelyn remained in her room, reading quietly, the muffled sounds of tension reaching her without stirring any urgency to intervene. She had anticipated this phase, the scramble to regain control once assumptions collapsed. In the afternoon, Mark knocked again, more urgently this time, asking Evelyn to sit down and talk, his voice carrying a pleading edge he had not used in years. Evelyn opened the door and listened as he spoke quickly, referencing family bonds, shared history, mistakes made in frustration. She waited until he finished, then replied calmly that decisions had been made thoughtfully and reflected the truth of recent events. There was no accusation in her tone, only certainty. Mark asked if anything could be reconsidered, his desperation plain. Evelyn shook her head gently, saying that reconsideration required respect that had not been shown. The answer stunned him into silence. As the day wore on, phone calls went unanswered. Messages piled up, shifting from confusion to apology to subtle pressure. Rachel attempted to soften the situation, suggesting they had all been under stress, that words had been misinterpreted, that no one meant harm. Evelyn listened briefly, then said that meaning mattered less than impact, and ended the conversation. Lucas, growing frantic, lashed out verbally, accusing Evelyn of overreacting, of punishing everyone for a single comment. Evelyn did not engage. She understood that accountability felt like injustice to those unaccustomed to it. That evening, the family gathered in the living room without her, voices rising and falling in anxious debate. They spoke of consequences, of futures suddenly uncertain, of plans unraveling. The weight of their reliance became unmistakable, and with it, the realization that they had dismissed the very foundation supporting them. Evelyn observed none of it directly, choosing instead to step outside briefly, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling grounded in the quiet beyond the house. When she returned, the tension remained, unresolved and heavy. Mark attempted one final appeal, asking if there was anything he could do to repair the damage. Evelyn met his gaze and said repair began long before loss, not after. The statement ended the discussion. As night settled, the family retreated to separate rooms, each processing the shift in their own way. Fear replaced entitlement. Regret replaced dismissal. Evelyn closed her door and sat at her desk, reflecting not on what had been taken, but on what had been reclaimed. The reaction unfolding around her confirmed what she already knew. The absence of her support had exposed the truth more clearly than any argument ever could. They were confronting consequences not because she was cruel, but because she was no longer willing to be invisible. The realization would continue to unfold long after this night, but Evelyn felt no need to witness every moment. She had already stepped beyond the role they assigned her, and the echoes of their panic only affirmed that the boundary she set was both necessary and overdue. Evelyn Carter woke to a quieter house than she had known in years, not the peaceful quiet of early mornings she once cherished, but a subdued stillness shaped by caution and restraint. The family moved carefully now, their conversations muted, their routines altered by uncertainty. Mark left early without speaking, his shoulders tense, his expression fixed somewhere between worry and disbelief. Rachel followed later, avoiding Evelyn's gaze as she passed through the hallway, her steps quick, her composure fragile. Lucas lingered longer than usual, pacing the living room with restless energy, his confidence eroded by the realization that words once dismissed as harmless had reshaped his future. Evelyn observed none of this directly, choosing instead to prepare her breakfast at her own pace, savoring the simplicity of toast and coffee without distraction. The days that followed unfolded with similar restraint. Messages continued to arrive, their tone evolving from apology to negotiation to resignation. Evelyn did not respond. She understood that explanations would only reopen a door she had deliberately closed. Her silence was not punishment but boundary, a clear signal that the time for justification had passed. When she did encounter her family, exchanges were brief and polite, stripped of familiarity. The dynamic had changed irreversibly, and each interaction reinforced that truth. Evelyn spent her afternoons walking through the neighborhood, greeting acquaintances who knew her only as herself, not as a provider or fallback. She rediscovered routines she had abandoned, reading in the park, enjoying lunch alone, making plans without consulting anyone else's schedule. The absence of obligation felt lighter than she expected, a reminder that independence was not loneliness but autonomy reclaimed. Inside the house, the family adjusted awkwardly. Mark confronted realities he had avoided, calculating finances without Evelyn's quiet support, recognizing gaps he once ignored. Rachel grappled with uncertainty, her sense of security shaken by the loss of what she had assumed permanent. Lucas oscillated between anger and regret, his words replaying in his mind now stripped of bravado. He attempted once to apologize directly, standing in Evelyn's doorway with an unsteady voice, admitting he had spoken carelessly. Evelyn listened and acknowledged his apology with a nod, but offered no reassurance beyond that. Forgiveness did not require restoration. Over time, the tension softened into acceptance. The family learned to function within new limits, though not without difficulty. Evelyn noticed the shift without satisfaction or resentment. She had not acted to teach a lesson, only to align her life with her values. The decision she made had not been impulsive, and its permanence brought a sense of peace she had not anticipated. On a quiet evening weeks later, Evelyn sat by the window watching dusk settle over the yard she no longer felt responsible to maintain for others. The house behind her carried the sounds of adjusted routines, unfamiliar but no longer unsettling. She reflected on how easily people confuse generosity with obligation, how silence was often mistaken for consent. The words spoken to her at that dinner table had not wounded her because they were cruel, but because they were honest. They revealed a truth she had been shielding herself from for years. By responding with action rather than argument, Evelyn had reclaimed authority over her own narrative. The family would remember this chapter differently, framing it as loss or miscommunication, but Evelyn knew it as clarity. She did not feel diminished by what she withdrew, only strengthened by what she retained. As night fell, she closed the curtains and turned off the lights, comfortable in the knowledge that respect, once forfeited, could not be negotiated back into place. The balance had shifted, and with it, Evelyn had stepped fully into a future defined not by what she provided, but by who she chose to be. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was earned.